The media has been telling us that we're more split than ever, which is total crap. If you look at the voting logs from the most recent presidential election, and you break it down by voting group, whether that's by ethnicity or by state or by socioeconomic status or educational status, there's some really interesting stuff in there. So for example, Vermont, generally considered the most liberal state, a state where they think that Bernie Sanders is barely tolerable because he's so conservative. 30% of the population voted for Trump. In Wyoming, where half the population are working cowboys, 30% of the population voted for Biden. Those were the two most extreme states. And that ratio, 30% voting for the other guy, is actually higher than the 50-year average. We're actually less likely to be polarized as a nation now than we've been before. What's changed is social media. The people that we normally lock in the basement because they're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs have bullhorns now, and they have been able to dominate the noise and the conversation. So the solution here isn't no more Trump or no more Biden or more Biden. The solution is to figure out how to manage social media in a more productive way. We've done this before. We've dealt with this before. The last big time that we had a democratization of information exchange, if you will, is when the telegraph came in. Back then, we had a little guy by the name of Pulitzer, if you remember him, who just started making shit up about the Spanish, and it got us into a war. Now, we got Cuba out of that. We got the Philippines out of that. It was an easy war, but still, it probably shouldn't have happened. And as a result of Pulitzer's actions, we started getting things like libel laws. We need some equivalent of that for social media, which means that the 1996 Telecommunications Act has to be amended so that social media platforms can't be used in their current manner. That is a job, unfortunately, for Congress. No one can decide where to draw the lines except for Congress.
Okay.
If we screw up relations with Mexico, we will regret that for a century. They're our largest trading partner. They will become our tightest intermingled demographic group within the decade. They are our #1 security partner, and we have a lot of common problems when it comes to things like immigration, the drug war, tariffs, all of it. If we get that relationship right, all of our other problems are pretty minor. But if we screw that up, yikes. When we move out of a globalized system where we've got like 30 countries that we care about any given time, and Mexico's at like number 27, it's not a big deal. But in a post-globalized system, when we only really care about 5 countries and Mexico's #1, that should be a relationship we get right. I've got some concerns about the current president, AMLO. He's a populist leftist who has some very serious authoritarian streaks. He got along great with Trump. Relations with Biden are getting off to a little bit of a rocky start, but nothing disastrous. But if we get that one right, everything else is something where we'll have Mexico's back. I mean, think about it. The United States has the healthiest demography in the developed world, and Mexico has the healthiest demography in the developing world. So we are going to be dealing with each other for the next century, regardless of anything that else goes down. I'd rather have that be friendly. In the broader world, I'm really not all that concerned. There's a culture shift that we're going to have to adapt to. We have been the agent, the guarantor of global order since 1945. And we're now, bit by bit, not just dropping that, but inverting it and becoming an agent of disorder. Because global chaos is actually really good for the United States, because most countries can't reach us, can't even pretend to reach us. They have interests much closer to home. And anything that keeps the rest of the world busy with the rest of the world gives the United States all kinds of strategic freedom. But adopting a French-style strategic policy is something that our defense establishment is not trained for. And that's going to require some very strong leadership from the top and a lot of very clear directives on things like rules of engagement that we're just not used to. That's not going to happen overnight, and I'm not sure Biden is even thinking that way right now. But the way our policy went under Obama and then under Trump and now under Biden is clearly pushing us in that direction. I would rather have our military and our intelligence assets prepared for that rather than it just being tossed in their lap to see what happens. No, because I don't even have I don't even have a prediction for what the Democratic and Republican coalition is going to look right now. Too much is in motion internal to the parties. The fact that we've got factions of the Trump coalition now advocating against Trump is kind of emblematic of how much churn we have right now. So until that settles out a little bit, I can't make a prediction, but about a year from now, we'll be starting the primaries for the midterms. And that'll give us a really good idea of just what sort of coalitions are emerging as we go through this journey. That's a work in progress for me. It's easy for me to say climate change is happening, but you can't just say raising temperatures and rising sea levels and expect me to tell you what's going to go down on a zip code level. One of the problems with predicting climate change effects is all politics are local, all geopolitics are local. And you can have a situation that is a net negative for the planet that's a net positive for some geography. So a couple examples real quick. Consider Australia. Last summer before last, they had horrible wildfires, the worst in their history, devastated their tourism, devastated their agriculture. It was a really crap year. The problem is, of course, that they're getting more thermal radiation from the sun. It dried out an area that was already arid, excuse me. As a result, the whole place was a tinderbox and it got lit, and something like 1 billion acres and billions of animals were killed. It was just awful. Consider Illinois. Had this same temperature increase, but it's a different climate zone. It's not arid, it's humid continental. So for Australia, the temperature increase was primarily during the day. In Illinois, it's primarily at night, which meant that Illinois now has 25 fewer frost and freeze nights than it did 50 years ago. It also means they're getting more water instead of less because it's a humid climate, which means that if this path continues, sometime this decade, most farmers in Illinois are going to be able to double crop. We're only now getting good enough data to start to make these differentiations and realize, how bad it gets in some places, how good it gets in some places. And then we have to look at the entire map of the world with fresh eyes, because the baseline will have changed for everything. This suggests dry places get drier, hot places get hotter, wet places get wetter. That's really bad for India. That's horrible for Brazil. That's horrible for Australia. It's wonderful for New Zealand. It's wonderful for the Midwest. It's wonderful for the East Coast. It's horrible for California. It's great for Seattle. We're having to learn this all over again. But what I can guarantee you is that the parts of the world that didn't develop on their own before the global order started in 1945, they didn't develop on their own for good reason. Their geographies aren't as stable. They're not as wealthy. They're not as temperate. Those are the places that are likely to get hit harder by what's coming. And then you just have to look at whether the people can walk somewhere else. In the United States, the only people who can walk here are in Mexico, where they had a baby bust 20 years ago, and we've had net negative migration from Mexico for 11 years now. Or Central America, where the baby bust started later, but is much more intense. So we're probably only going to face another 10 years of that migration. They're just going to run out of people. That's it for North America. That's done. But, you're looking at the African continent getting really ugly, and you're looking at the Middle East getting really ugly, and all those people can walk to Europe. So whether it's with demographics or whether it's climate science, the United States is going to be able to look out across the world and make decisions based on what works and what doesn't everywhere else. We have the most valuable resource available to us right now. We have time. That's just not something that anyone else has.